Well, good evening, one and all. And tonight we're looking at a passage that in many ways is very timely because it's just before we enter into the Christmas services beginning tomorrow night. And it was tonight, a Wednesday night, and Jesus was gathered together for dinner with his friends the night before the biggest event in the Jewish calendar, the Passover. And I suspect that as the disciples were sitting in the room, they probably felt the excitement and anticipation that something big was about to happen. Jesus had been telling them quite a lot about what was going to take place. That he was making his way to Jerusalem. Something special was going to happen. They couldn't quite make sense of it all. He kept speaking about the fact that he was going to be taken captive, he was going to be beaten, crucified, and then rise victorious. And of course, when we hear it being said, we're really clear on what this is all about. But for the disciples, this just seemed so foreign to them. They'd watched Jesus so many times have power to overturn adversities, heal diseases, let the blind to see, calm furious storms, even raise the dead. And so as they followed him, they probably had a sort of nervous anticipation and a bit of uncertainty, but I think they were probably following him gladly, boldly, expectantly. Because I think they probably, even though they could hear what Jesus was saying, they couldn't quite take it on. And I think they kind of came into this Passover time believing that that same outstretched arm and glorious overturning of the enemy that God had done in that first Passover in Egypt, God was going to do it again. So here they are, gathered in this room on the eve of Passover, enjoying a meal with their friends, their comrades. And into this room comes a woman. Now, Mark doesn't tell us her name. John does, but Mark doesn't. And I think it's because Mark actually wants to keep her anonymous. So we don't know anything about her. We don't know whether she's single or married, whether she's got kids or no kids. We're just told she is a woman. And I wonder whether Mark wants to keep her nameless because he wants to emphasise in some way her comparative insignificance and smallness in this massive drama that's about to take place, these events and people on the world stage that were going to happen around her. Now we hear it a little bit in verses 1 and 2, where we hear that there's this developing plot to destroy Jesus. We hear of the chief priests and the teachers of the law, powerful men, well known, used to having control, putting in place strategies to rid themselves of Jesus. They are threatening in their power. And so just before we have this little moment in this room, we hear of this ominous storm clouds, this plot that is taking place to destroy Jesus. And here in this room, reclining at dinner, there was the 12, plus there would have been extras, but predominantly men who were gathered, Jesus in a circle. So this woman comes into this room with that backdrop, the machinations of powerful men, these disciples, these men. And she is a woman. And that culturally meant that she was not as significant as a man. And as a woman, had very little power or control over her life. And she enters the room and does something that Jesus declares is so beautiful, so significant, so powerful, that he says, what she does will be remembered and spoken about throughout the world and throughout history. It will be spoken of into eternity. The chief priests, the teachers of the law, they're gone. They're not remembered. But here we are, sitting in Leichhardt, across the other side of the world, thousands of years later, and we are hearing about this woman. What did she do that was so amazing and that brought the most highest praise from Jesus that I think he gave to anyone? She comes into the room with an alabaster jar. And an alabaster jar was filled with very costly nard. That is a very pure perfume. It was the most expensive perfume you could get. It probably came from India, near the Himalayas. And some believe that what it was her family inheritance. It may have been something that was passed down from generation to generation. It provided the family with some sort of financial security. Others think it may have been her dowry, because in that culture you couldn't get married without a dowry. So maybe that was what this was. Whichever it was, what we know is it was rare and very, very precious. And she makes her way to Jesus at the table. Now, don't think of Jesus sitting up at a table like we do. It would have been a very low table, and they would be reclining either on couches or on rugs, and they would recline such that their head and hands were close to the table and their feet would have been fanning out. So she makes her way to Jesus, and no doubt she had caught the attention of all those in the room. They probably expected that she would just take the top off and maybe just put a couple of drops on Jesus' head, maybe even just a little bit more so it flowed down his head into his beard. That would not be uncommon. It would be perfectly sensible, acceptable, reasonable. Quite a nice thing to do to him, actually. But instead, and you imagine you're there, and she comes in and she's got the jar and she literally smashes the bottle top, breaks the neck of it. So everyone in the room now knows there's no going back. This jar will not hold that perfume anymore. And she pours the whole contents out on Jesus' head in just one moment. In just one moment, she pours out what we're told later is effectively worth over a year's wages. Some have estimated that it probably could have been worth as much, if not more than $30,000. $30,000 is an awful lot of money if you don't have a lot of money. I was at a dinner party last night and we were all chatting about what would we do if we won the lottery. It's kind of a good question to ask, isn't it? What would you do if you won the lottery? This is literally what she's got. She's got the lottery, 30,000. And in one moment, she breaks the lot on Jesus' head. Gone. Now, what was the reaction of everyone in the room? Well, we heard it. Absolute shock and horror. I wouldn't be surprised if at the time she was doing it, there were almost these audible gasps in the room. And then came the condemnations. We are told that those who were present, probably suspect that we're talking about the 12, they were furious. They're absolutely livid. Her actions were completely offensive to them. And they talked about the waste of this. What an absolute waste. She was completely mad. This was the most stupid, reckless thing you could possibly do. I was thinking about it, and my brother-in-law's father, who's now dead, but he loved tawny ports. And if any of you are into alcohol of any kind, you'll know that you can collect the port for each year. And he started collecting them back in 1948, and he collected a bottle of port for each year till when he died 10 years ago. A bottle could be worth 1,000 now, 1,000, maybe more, right? It was like an investment for him, a hobby. And it wouldn't be unusual if he was to open one of those bottles on a really significant celebration, or maybe at the birth of one of his grandchildren. But imagine if one night we're all sitting around and he's there and he breaks every single bottle open for us to drink. He just says, we're doing it. We're going to do the lot. And he's doing it for one person. Celebration of one person. You know what was my first thought as I was thinking of this, trying to think of the parallels? I did exactly what the disciples did. I don't know whether you're doing it. I sat and I thought, 1948, started adding up the years, thinking about $1,000 a bottle maybe in the early. I started calculating how much that would be. Because I was wow, that'd be a lot. Well, that's exactly what the disciples did. All they could see was this is an enormous amount of money that is just being blown and wasted. She's just wasted it all. It's like she's just poured it down the drain. They began to calculate how much it was. And not only did they calculate how much it was, they started thinking, you know what, this could have been used for so much more. You know, it'd be like, you know, we win the lottery. What could we use that for? What we could use that money for? Well, they're sitting there going, that money, can you imagine what you could have done with that money? But it's amazing, isn't it, that when you want to denounce someone else's way of doing their money, how often we come up with a moralistic alternative. Have you heard the one about the fireworks in Sydney? Oh, they're wasting so much money on the fireworks. Can you imagine what they could do with that money for people in need? Well, these guys, they're coming up with the alternative and they're thinking, we could just, can you imagine what we could do for the poor? And the reason they thought of that is because around about this time, in the lead up to the Passover, often that's what people did. They collected money for the poor. So they're just pouring out on her. They are just letting this woman have it. Mark says they rebuked her harshly. I suspect she felt belittled, put down, and made to feel a complete and utter fool. I find myself wondering, did she begin to self-doubt? Did she think, you know, have I got this wrong? Did she have feelings of shame and embarrassment and think, I just want the ground to open up and for it to swallow me up? Because here she is, being denounced publicly at this table by these men. But you know, it's funny, isn't it, how often we read the Gospels and find that the disciples' reactions to things are so often completely the opposite to the way Jesus reacts. They're often critical of people or actions that they should be welcoming or praising. And how often is that true of us? To them, her actions were wasteful and they were offended. To Jesus, what she did was beautiful. And he was offended at their response to her. And he said, leave her alone. Why are you bothering her? She's done a beautiful thing to me. Leave her alone. Perhaps more like, let her go. Don't constrain her. Don't stop her. Don't try to control her. Don't try to tell her what to do. Let her be. Let her do what she did. How wonderful it must have been for this woman to have heard Jesus' words. To suddenly hear through all those condemnatory voices, this one voice above them all, who affirmed her, praised her. To hear these words that what she had done would be remembered for a long time. Had this woman gone mad? Was what she'd done, was it wasteful? Yeah, it was. Unless you thought there was someone far more precious in that room than that perfume. Is what she did wasteful? Yeah, yes it was. Unless you knew that there was someone in that room that you were so indebted to for your very existence and for being at the receiving end of such divine love. Was it wasteful? Yeah, unless you knew that this was a very significant night, one that wasn't going to come your way again, and you had to act. Because what this woman did actually reveals to us so much. She wasted that whole bottle of extremely expensive perfume to reveal to every other disciple in the room and to you and I, this man is precious. This man is precious. He's worth everything. He's the treasure in the field and the pearl of great price that is so worth having that you're going to give up everything to have him. He was the one in which there is security and safety that nothing in the world can provide. He was the one in which she would find her future, her true inheritance, both in this world and the world to come. He was worth everything. And I'm sure the disciples in that room, they loved Jesus. You and I love Jesus. Like them, we're deeply committed. Jesus' disciples had given up livelihoods, had left families to follow Jesus. Of course they loved him. Of course you and I love him. And yet here we are confronted with this deeply personal, raw, heart-wrenching, uninhibited act of abandonment that kind of exposes the poverty of their love and ours, doesn't it? And the beautiful thing is they, like us, God is at work. And they eventually get it. Most of them will actually give up their life because of their faith in Jesus. And they would end up being able to say, as Paul the Apostle says in Philippians, that everything that they ever achieved in life and anything that the world could offer was utter rubbish compared to the surpassing greatness of knowing Jesus. This is what this woman says to us. He is so precious. It is worth giving up everything for him. I found this a hard sermon to write because this woman shows me up. I feel the poverty of my love for Jesus when I see the extravagance of her actions, the recklessness, the madness. I too often want to play it safe, keep it reasonable and moderate. Don't you? And yet I don't think she's meant to be unique. I think she's who we are to aspire to. And we need to hear Jesus' wholesale commendation that what she did was beautiful. So don't be constrained. Don't hold back. Jesus would say, I'm worth it. I'm worth it. And this woman, she wasted that whole bottle of expensive perfume to reveal what every other disciple in that room didn't fully see, and that was how much Jesus had done for her and for them all. This was such an extraordinary act of devotion from someone who knew that Jesus deeply loved her. He loved her despite her failure and sin. He loved her with gentleness and grace. He loved her in such a way that it was fulfilling her. And we know that because she gave up what could have effectively been her dowry. It's amazing how often Jesus says in the Gospels that our love for him will be directly related to how much we know he's forgiven us. If you and I want to know how to love him like she did, we've got to pray some dangerous prayers. They're dangerous but good prayers to pray. And that is to ask Jesus to gently show us the depth of our sin. I say gently. But to ask him to show us the depth of our sin. Not so you and I cower in despair, but so we can rise up with confidence in the knowledge that we are wonderfully and deeply loved by our forgiving Saviour. This woman was able to abandon herself to Jesus and in front of all those people because she had experienced the freedom of forgiveness, the unconditional love that enables you to act with courage, to take risks, to be generous and extravagant. And maybe tonight is a good night to pray a dangerous prayer. Jesus, show me the depth of my sin that I might love you more like this woman. This woman wasted that whole bottle of extremely expensive perfume to reveal what every other disciple in the room didn't fully see, and that is Jesus was a dead man walking. Jesus says to those in the room, you're not going to have me here forever. And what she did what she could. She poured perfume on my body beforehand to prepare me for my burial. Somehow, despite Jesus telling his disciples over and over and over again what was going to happen to him, they didn't get it, but she did. I wonder whether she had decided she wanted to anoint Jesus after his death, but she heard how he talked about his coming death and she realised she needed to do it before. Why? Because the only form of burial where you don't get the appropriate preparation of perfume on your body was if you're convicted of being a criminal. And maybe she, more than the other disciples, she heard what Jesus was saying and she realised the kind of death that he was facing. I wonder whether this woman wanted to demonstrate her love for Jesus but didn't know how. What could she do? Did she pray and ask God, show me? Did God show her what she could do and compel her that she needed to do it this night? She acted. She did what she could. She broke the jar of perfume and let it pour over Jesus, and the room was filled with the aroma of life in contrast to the stench of death. A beautiful, fragrant act that happened in this part of Mark's gospel in between stories of death and betrayal. She did what she could. I'm aware some of you here and some of those online, you feel the limitations of your life sometimes, perhaps because of your health, family circumstances, maybe your financial circumstances. You might be in a loveless marriage, lonely single, difficult children. There are all sorts of things that we can feel constrained by and think, what can I do? And Jesus' commendation was, she did what she could. That's all he asks of us, to do what we can. What a remarkable woman, and what a strange kind of heroine. She's just a woman. That's not meant to be a put down, but in that culture, she was just a woman, a faceless, nameless, voiceless, powerless, despised, foolish woman. She was a nobody, but God made her somebody. She was put down, but Jesus raised her up. And I want to be like her, don't you? to have the ability to abandon myself to Jesus, to be reckless in love for him. And if I'm reckless in love for him, guess what? I'm going to be reckless in love to you guys. If I know how to be extravagant with him, I'm going to be extravagant and generous with you. I want to hear his voice of encouragement and commendation, to be foolish for him, and hear his voice above all the others want to deride me for being foolish and wasteful. Well, friends, she actually picked up the craziness from Jesus, from hanging around with him. For if ever there was a person who loved over the top, wastefully, extravagantly, is Jesus and his Father. And I don't think it's any accident that Mark puts this story right here, because as we read on, we'll see Jesus seated with his 12 disciples ready to celebrate the Passover, which it'll then become the Lord's Supper. There he is, seated with his 12. And who's in that room? Well, there's Judas, who's going to betray him. There's Peter, who will deny him. There's the rest of the disciples. They're all going to desert him. And seated with the men, with him, are those men who derided a woman because she actually got how precious he was. And seated there are you and I. We're at that table with our failings as disciples and our unbelief. And he shows his disciples and he shows us that he will do for us exactly what that woman did for him. She brought a beautiful alabaster jar and she broke it. And Jesus said, my body is that jar, and I'm going to break it over you. She poured out of the jar the perfume that was in it so that the fragrance of it filled the room. And Jesus says, I'm going to pour out of the jar of my body, precious blood, all of it, every single drop for you. And the fragrance of it may fill your life and fill the whole earth. Yes, this woman's love was a response to the reckless, over-the-top love of God, who sent his Son to die for his enemies, for the wicked, for the self-centred, for the betrayers, the deniers, the cold-hearted, the critical, the penny-pinching, for the disciples who don't see the true value of his Son. And when we see Jesus, when we see what he has done, friends, it's divine madness. It's incomprehensible. May we ask Jesus to make us reckless and wasteful for him. For friends, he is worthy.